Capoeira called me through an audition. I remember seeing the call out, looking for black or mixed race women who speak Portuguese and can move. The audition was for a play called Firecracker by Helena Moraes, an interwoven non-linear story that jumped through time between the events during the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, focused on the reign of Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba, modern-day Angola, then to the present-day Brazil, highlighting at the time the assassination of Brazilian councilwoman Marielle Franco in 2018 and her driver Anderson Gomes. Now I didn't get the role, but when I went to see this play, this all-female cast depicted how black women were integral for the fight for justice, whether reflecting on the past or the present. I felt that I started to become aware of something, remember something in my body. These embodiments of resistance, survival, I recognized them in myself. They were a part of my story. I felt it deep in my core, but I just didn't understand how yet. It was as if the past, the present, and the future were all having a conversation with one another, and at the heart of this play was capoeira. Capoeira is an Afro-Brazilian martial art, a form of African and indigenous resistance. It has elements of music, storytelling, acrobatics, dance, spirituality, but really it encompasses everything. Through the bodies, the lives of those who were captured, everything that they were living in their day-to-day life. Using capoeira, many enslaved people were able to find refuge from their oppressors, to formulate communities, quilombos, the Kimbundu word for war camp. It was in these quilombos where they created strategies of resistance, not just a place to hide away, but a space to fight against the conditions of slavery. What was a complete contradiction to my first close encounter with capoeira is that when I began to practice, and even till this day more often than not, I am the only black woman or even the only black person entirely. Of course, things are changing, but I decided to focus on the invisibility of black women in this space, and through that, it gave me an opportunity to actually widen my understanding of not only the history of capoeira, but specific histories that speak to who we are, histories that have literally shaped our minds, our bodies, and placed us exactly where we are today. I realize sometimes what is missing can still reveal information through the memory of our bodies, the archives that we are carrying. What it also highlighted to me is that my experience could actually be important to balance the inequalities and biases still held in how our histories are recorded and how they will inform our futures. Remembering, reclaiming, and recentering stories that have been lost, stolen, and forgotten due to colonization. What story are you holding? Have you asked yourself? And this is important for you to ask yourself this, because knowledge begins from where you are. In an online lecture with Professor Ngongi Wa-Fiongo, he explained how colonization shifted the cognitive process of knowledge that should begin from where you are, but rather now it begins from the imperial center to where you are. And when we understand how much colonization has affected bodies, if our bodies, our centers are not our own, then what we do can never fully benefit us. This is the struggle. In Bell Hook's essay on radical openness, she talks about this struggle. The oppressed struggle in a language to recover ourselves, to reconcile, to reunite, to renew. Our words are not without meaning, they are an action, a resistance. Language is also a place of struggle. This is what we are doing here. This is what this research brought me to understand, that working with the struggle of language, we need to ask what is allowed to be part of that struggle for our problems. What do we consider as a language for our solutions? And for me, Capoeira Angola as an ancestral practice could be valued as a language that can interrogate structures, as it always fundamentally has. But of course, as I also understood through my research and experience, Capoeira also in itself is a structure that can be oppressive, since it has also inherited this history that has shifted the cognitive process of knowledge. It has also been distorted by systems of oppression and violence. This just may be what you have to do to survive. As the great Toni Morrison once stated, sometimes you don't survive whole, you only survive in parts. And for this reason, the idea of standing in resistance has to be a very conscious choice. It is particular and unique to each body at play, where one must interrogate each micro-history that is occurring or has occurred or is yet to within our bodies. The same can be said for the practice of Capoeira. Still, Capoeira Angola highlights how bodies are located in struggle, and it also highlights the locations of that struggle. Its physical orientation forces an integration of something internal as we begin to move in ways that we are not accustomed to. These ways of moving begin to interrogate the layers of movement of bodies that we have embodied, that have molded, shaped us from the inside out, the dialogue that began in our mother's womb. What this research highlighted to me is that when we integrate ancestral or indigenous practices in the present, in a practical way, when we make time for this, it could benefit our futures, how we co-create our futures. And it is as simple and as complex as beginning from where you are, your body, and uncovering the story that it holds. Hello, good people. Welcome to this third episode of Unspoken Podcast. I am Anna Paz, and you were just listening to me giving you a brief performative introduction and conclusion of my thesis, coming to voice through Capoeira, uncovering the ancestrality and embodiments of the African Diaspora. If you're interested in reading that thesis, I will leave a link in the description of this podcast. Happy New Year to everyone. I hope you've come into this month refreshed, ready to flow into the year. And if not, we still have until spring to readjust. I want to thank everyone who listened to the last 2 episodes. I got some really good feedback, and I'm really hoping to build on that and continue to get better and give you guys the content that you want, as well as what it is that I want to share with you. I'm working on having interviews now with special guests, which will be coming up in the next month. If you have any ideas of people who would be interested in having a conversation with me, please don't hesitate to hit me up. Let me know. If there are also topics that you would like me to express on this podcast, I really want this to be a collaborative space where we're learning together. I will leave a link in the description of this podcast, but if you do follow that link, please do me a favor and subscribe to our YouTube and follow us on Instagram. So now let's get into episode 3. And like I said, this was a little bit of a performative introduction and conclusion of my master's thesis. And this is going to be part 1 of a 6-part series where I'm going to go over the main chapters in my thesis. I recognize that not everyone is going to read 100 pages, and I do think that some of the content that is in there could be interesting to explore and share within this podcast. It was actually one of the things that inspired me to create this podcast, is to use the voice to make work like this more accessible. I thought I was going to start this series talking about what is Capoeira and what is its recorded history, to give people obviously the very natural foundation of understanding what it is that I'm talking about. But I wanted to turn things on its head and go further down the line on my research, where I began to understand and uncover the embodiments of nature within this practice, and actually having some literature that backed that up and backed up what the practice itself already expresses. The more I read into African and indigenous traditions and cosmologies, the more I begin to understand the relevance of nature and our environment around us in understanding who we are and how we navigate the spaces that we're in. I do think if we don't have this lens lens first when looking at a practice like capoeira, then a lot can go amiss in terms of how we relate to it. So this is why I wanted to begin with this perspective, even if it doesn't make sense, even when we think about how history is recorded. I just want to test and see if this helps us to be less reductive or narrow-minded for the future episodes to come. One of the books I'll be quoting from that actually helped me so much in my research and my understanding of Capoeira Angola was by Jorge Conceição. The title of the book is Capoeira Angola, Educação Pluriétnica Corporal e Ambiental. And that translates into English, Capoeira Angola, Pluriethnic, Corporal and Environmental Education. This elder has since transitioned, so I feel very privileged and honored that I was able to obtain one of his books when I was in Bahia. Otherwise, I'm not sure I would have come across his work. Just to quote from page 59, Conceição explains, "Life is the magic of cosmic energy, a diversity of non-organic manifestations or forms that decrystallize minerals into soft, complex vegetation, animal and other arrangements that we call biodiversity. Therefore, being a microorganism, or a macro tissue should not be the indicative, quantitative, and qualitative indicator to measure the degree of importance of one form of life in relation to another, but rather by the role that each of these vital expressions has in the unity of life itself." This is why I wanted to start with this. This is to say that within Capoeira Angola, there is this embodiment of nature as it exists within us, but also from our environment that extends to other animals and living organisms that don't necessarily have to come into contact in a chronological, direct way with us. Time or space reveals it as a part of our corporal knowledge, memory, and ancestrality. On page 100 of his book, he talks about competitive capoeira, how it distances us from Capoeira Angola that identifies within the principles of natural life, our corporal movement, free and light and playful, to recreate and renovate the authentic identity within the principles of being cosmo-visionaries of nature. This is what can be explored in the game of capoeira. And with this in mind, without nature, capoeira really only becomes a mechanical operation. And what is brought to the forefront is more about aesthetics and forms and I guess beauty that remains in squares or boxes or even circles, I guess, when we're talking about capoeira. I think this can be transferred into other areas in society and culture when we reduce the natural life in the ways that we create, live, and think. We are reducing ourselves to mechanical operations that may be allowing us to excel in some areas, but in other areas of our lives, it's actually setting us back. When we think about the impact of the transatlantic slave trade, of colonization on bodies, but also land, and the nature that contributes to the way that we embody the encoding for survival, how that has influenced perhaps the development of capoeira. Now I want to talk about Ngolo. Ngolo has at times been considered as a predecessor of capoeira, which is also referred to as the zebra fight. Ngolo is a Kikongo word meaning strength, originating from southern Angola. One of the main reasons for this comparison came about through some sketches made in the 1960s by a Portuguese artist named Albem Neves, and he was living in Luanda and visited Bahia in this time. Ngolo consists of roundhouse kicks coming from below, either with the hand on the floor or not. And these kicks can be closely identified or compared to kicks in capoeira like Rabo de Arraia or Meia Lua de Compasso. And these parallels can also be drawn, from the ritual that ties everything together. The circle, two opponents facing each other, moving around in a circular motion. There's also clapping and a call and response from spectators. But what I find most interesting is that it's also been identified or called the zebra fight. Why is it called the zebra fight? The zebra, native to Africa, often displays a really powerful kick with both of its back legs when defending itself, and it really looks similar to the kicks used in capoeira. So even if Ngolo is not situated within the same principles of capoeira, Ngolo could be embodying bodies that have expressed themselves within the conditions of survival that surpass only relating to human beings. This also suggests the influences of the physical land and nature of Brazil during the period of the transatlantic slave trade. There are many expressions and references in capoeira to particular animals, creatures, plants, and deities relating to the culture that is indigenous to that land. So if we consider Ngolo as an ancestor, one of many, it is that it points us in a direction of understanding our histories and embodiments differently than we have been doing. Highlighting and upholding this can therefore expand our ways of thinking in terms of the embodiments that we have inherited. Conceição explains further on page 100. A human mind that is free of the box or square thinking can dance with the choreography of microorganisms, fishes, crustaceans, monkeys, seeing them as accomplices and companions in ancestry. Of course, this raises the question, the debate, as always in capoeira, whether it was a combat, a fighting style in the continent of Africa that was brought over to Brazil, or was it developed in Brazil? And we can get into that discussion another day. I don't think it is black and white, but I think the limited research about capoeira and its roots on the continent, and specifically Angola, from most popular scholars suggesting that there isn't enough evidence, and they also state that those who are suggesting that there is a clear connection are doing so through a very Afrocentric lens. Although I do agree that this remains a debate, I do think that when it comes to attempting to understand previous cultures in Angola or the continent or Brazil, with Eurocentric ideas of knowledge, there will be a limit to what extent you can understand. And in such an oppressive time of forced erasure, how can we really reconcile with the traditional Western modalities of recording histories when we know that it continues to erase certain narratives, whether conscious or not? But I do believe that we have to reconcile with it. We have to work with it, right? And maybe one of the ways that we can is that we need to honor how the natural life or the biodiversity of life around us and inside of us has knowledge. And it helps us to consider and reclaim other ways of knowing, which is what traditional African and indigenous practices do. To give a bit more context, I want to share a quote from a paper from a study published in 1979 by Gerard Kubik titled Angolan Traits in Black Music, Games, Dances of Brazil. It explains, some components of a cultural heritage can also be transmitted unconsciously between individuals and ultimately from generation to generation. A trait sometimes disappears from the surface of a specific culture for a certain historical period, for 50 or 100 years, including all verbal references to it. After some time, however, when circumstances are favorable and a need arises, the lost trait may be reinvented. In a time of slavery and oppression, some specific cultural traits may be forced to disappear among their carriers. They only retreat to a safer area of the psyche. The implication is that in the New World, there is a lot of African cultural material beneath the surface. When I conducted this research, engaging with my perspective as a Black woman in these spaces of capoeira, it really began to open this space to how evidence can appear, specifically in our bodies that dwell in spaces of survival, and that these things are not always recorded or spoken. But when you begin to work through your embodiments, through different modalities, African or indigenous modes of knowledge, it may begin to reveal very slowly that which is unspoken, and simultaneously you begin to unpick some of the inherent biases within how our histories have been recorded and understood. For this reason, I believe it is important to not eliminate that there are similarities with something like Ngolo and Capoeira or whatever it may be, but let's focus on them as an understanding that there is more to learn, there is more to reveal or to feel, not that there isn't enough connection or enough evidence. If there is a focus on that, then maybe we can begin to distance ourselves from a reductive way of seeing and hearing, lived experiences, no matter where we go, whether human or not. Thank you for listening to this episode. I'll see you on the next one.
Quem vem de Angola, oh, Sinhá, vem conhecer. Quem vem de Angola, oh, Sinhá, vem conhecer. Quem vem de Angola, oh, Sinhá, vem conhecer. Quem vem de Angola. Oh, Sinhá, vem conhecer. Quem vem de Angola, oh, Sinhá, vem conhecer. Quem vem de Angola, oh, Sinhá, vem conhecer. Quem vem de Angola, oh, Sinhá, vem conhecer. Quem vem de Angola. Houve aqui um mensageiro acabando de contar. Tem medo na senzala, é mais leve que o ar. Tirando a perna ligeiro, desafiando a razão. Fica de ponta a cabeça e rasteja pelo chão, assim.